Today's webinar will be presented by Geoff Bristow, who works as the Regional Energy Program Manager for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Office of Pollution Prevention and Energy Assistance. Based out of DEP's Northwest Regional Office, Geoff has over 20 years of experience developing and implementing energy programs that provide technical assistance, education, and financial assistance on energy efficiency and alternative energy within various sectors, including industry, commercial, municipal, and transportation. Geoff chairs the Energy Roundtable, a series of quarterly meetings in Western Pennsylvania that explores cost-saving energy management and energy efficiency opportunities for large energy consumers. Geoff is also on the board of directors for the Pennsylvania Biomass Energy Association and has been involved in numerous biomass energy projects, including woody biomass, biogas, and perennial grasses for thermal, CHP, and co-firing applications, all of which we've discussed in previous webinars. So welcome, Geoff. We're very happy to have you with us today to talk about this major initiative by the EPA that still remains a bit of a mystery in terms of its specific implementation at the state level. So we look forward to hearing a bit more about that today and hearing your thoughts. Feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Hey, if anytime anybody can't hear me clearly, just put something in the chat there. Sometimes I might drift away from the microphone, but good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us here today for this discussion on the potential for biomass energy in helping states meet greenhouse gas reduction targets under EPA's Clean Power Plan. And I have to tell you up front that I do not consider myself an expert on the Clean Power Plan, nor do I consider myself an expert on biomass. As you just heard from Sarah's introduction, that you probably picked up on the fact that my experience and job responsibilities here at the Pennsylvania Energy Office within DEP are very broad. The types of projects I work on can be anything from working with municipalities on street lighting upgrades to working with commercial trucking fleets to change to alternative fuels, to working with industry on things as simple as lighting upgrades to as complex as the installation of back pressure steam turbines. I do have some experience working in biomass projects, some of which Sarah had already mentioned. And it's because of that experience that I had in working with biomass projects and my role here in the Pennsylvania Energy Office that I was asked to participate as an ex officio board member on the PA Biomass Energy Association board. So I've been doing that for the last several months, and when this request came to Pennsylvania to provide a speaker to lead this discussion here today on biomass in the Clean Power Plan, the invite ended up coming to me. So here I am to present this here to you today, to lead this discussion. But I repeat, I don't consider myself an expert on biomass power, but there are folks out there who are. There are definitely some experts out there, and I urge you to evaluate the materials that folks such as the Biomass Power Association or DOE's Bioenergy Technology Office, among others, have available on this topic. In fact, the Biomass Power Association just last week teamed up with DOE's Bioenergy Technologies Office in the state of South Carolina for an excellent webinar on this very same topic of biomass power in the CPP. I'm not sure those webinar slides are posted online yet, at least I haven't found where they are, but we'll research that, and hopefully through Sarah I should be able to provide that link to you because there's some excellent information on there. If any of you who are tuned in to this presentation here today, tuned in to that one last week by Biomass Power Association and the Bioenergy Technologies Office, you're probably not going to get a whole lot new here in this presentation today. Hopefully I'll be able to provide some additional information to build on what they had presented, but I do consider those folks some more of the experts. Out there, 8 plans under EPA's Clean Power Plan. It's not my intent to focus specifically on Pennsylvania or what Pennsylvania will do with biomass in its plans, though I will from time to time use Pennsylvania as an example because that's obviously the situation I'm most familiar with. In Pennsylvania, we're open to all types of approaches, and we'll discuss at the end of the presentation how those in the biomass field can have their voices heard to possibly influence what ultimately ends up in state plans. One more thing before we move on. My intent is to not be a cheerleader for biomass or create the impression that I'm advocating biomass power over other approaches. So you're not going to see slides in this presentation that tout the benefits of biomass beyond what EPA might already highlight in its guidance, materials, or discussion related to biomass energy. I think that's more of a role of the trade associations and other stakeholders in the biomass field. My goal is simply to discuss what states will have to do to include biomass in CPP compliance strategies, discuss EPA's guidance that they've provided to date. I want to highlight some key considerations for biomass in the Clean Power Plan as identified by EPA. And then at the end, I think this is an important aspect of it, is identify stakeholder opportunities. As Sarah had mentioned, there's not a whole lot clear at this point about what's ultimately going to be in states' compliance plans or state implementation plans they submit to EPA. But one of the things that we do know is that now there's an opportunity to have your say. We'll get to that towards the end. Most of you are probably already familiar with the basics of the Clean Power Plan rule. And I emphasize the word basics because it's an almost 1,600-page document. I'm going to go into some detail on sections of that rule that address biomass. But first, I want to cover a few basics just to put the rest of this discussion here today into context. The Clean Power Plan is EPA's rule targeting the reduction of carbon pollution from electric generation units, otherwise known as EGUs. In particular, the focus is on reducing CO2 emissions from fossil fuel EGUs. There are 4 building blocks identified by EPA in the Clean Power Plan rule. They also refer to those as BSER, or Best Systems for Emissions Reduction. The building blocks are expected by EPA to be the major focus of compliance strategies and the most cost-effective means to meeting CO2 emissions reduction targets. And the building blocks are really readily available technology and economically viable solutions that are expected to form the foundations for state plans. I don't have those building blocks listed here, but I'll rattle them off here to you real quick. The first building block is increasing the operational efficiency of existing coal-fired steam generating units. The second building block is substituting increased generation at existing natural gas combined cycle units to replace generation at fossil-fueled steam electric generating units. The third building block is substituting generation from low and zero carbon emitting sources to replace fossil fuel fired generation at electric generating units. That third building block is where the biomass discussion comes in. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. That fourth building block, though, is one that is more on the demand side, that is increasing demand-side energy efficiency opportunities as a way to reduce the amount of fossil fuel-fired generation needed. So those are 4 basic building blocks. The rule itself targets reduction of CO2 as 32% reduction by 2030 at affected electric generating units, and that's 32% below 2012 levels. Each state is going to have its own individual goals for compliance, and the individual state goals are based partly on the mix of existing EGUs within that state. The goals for each state and the approaches that the states take to address CO2 emissions, there are 2 types. There are two basic ways that they can approach this. The first is in a mass-based approach. This is in a total maximum tons of CO2 emitted from affected EGUs within the state. An example, using Pennsylvania as the example, Pennsylvania has a mass-based total reduction for compliance that would go from about 117 million tons of CO2 in 2012 down to about 91 million tons by 2030. Mandatory reductions begin in 2022 and they're steadily decreasing increments from 2022 up to 2030. Okay. The other approach that can be taken by states is not a mass-based but a rate-based approach in maximum pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour of generation. Again, I'll use Pennsylvania as the example, kind of put some numbers on this and put it in perspective. In 2012, the rate in Pennsylvania for CO2 emissions was just under 1,700 pounds per megawatt hour of generation. In order to meet compliance requirements under the Clean Power Plan, Pennsylvania would need to reduce that to just about 1,100. So they would have to go from 1,700 down to about 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour by 2030. And again, compliance, interim compliance levels kick in 2022 and steadily decrease, the targets steadily decrease until we hit to 2030, the full compliance level. The key point here is that every state has the opportunity and flexibility under its Clean Power Plan to develop its own plan to meet compliance. But those state plans have to be approved by EPA. If a state opts to not submit a plan or implement its own plan, then a federal plan will be imposed in that state by the EPA. The first due date for draft plans for states that take this approach is September 16th, followed 2 years later by a final plan. So let's talk about the role of biomass in the Clean Power Plan. And the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of a couple of definitions. I have the definition here of biomass. This is a definition that is right out of the CPP Rule itself. And I'm not going to read this definition to you, but I do want to point out that in the last paragraph where there are various biomass sources are identified, these various sources indicate a very broad range of types of biomass that can be considered, including biogas from organic materials. And you know, a lot of times when people think of biomass, the first thing they think of is the combustion of woody biomass, but I want to point out that EPA has a pretty broad definition of biomass in the Clean Power Plan rule. A very critical aspect of any state's proposal to include biomass in its plan centers around this term, qualified biomass. As you see, as we proceed through EPA's discussion of biomass in the Clean Power Plan and other technical guidance, biomass fuel source will only be accepted in the plan if it's demonstrated as a method to control increases of CO2 levels in the atmosphere. EPA does not view all biomass fuel sources as carbon neutral, and we'll see that's clearly spelled out throughout their discussion in their technical guidance documents and in the rule itself. EPA addresses biomass in several ways throughout this near 1,600-page document, the Clean Power Plan rule. And in some of their preliminary discussions, they identify how EPA views the significant role of biomass in helping to combat the effects of climate change. Okay, so they're leading up to what the importance of biomass, and they first talk about the ability of biomass to act as a carbon sink and sequester carbon from the atmosphere. EPA estimates that about 13% of annual CO2 emissions in the U.S. are sequestered in growing biomass. The use of sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture practices are also identified as fostering climate resiliency, or in other words, that those practices can help our society and ecosystems to more readily handle the effects of climate change. But the point that we want to get to here is the next bullet item, that EPA identifies that biomass fuel supply can be used to displace some fossil fuel generation. In further discussion leading up to more in-depth analysis of biomass, One of the things that EPA does is they periodically identify different and broad examples of the types of biomass energy that they expect to see in state plans. They identify the combustion of biogenic material, including forest-derived and ag-derived sources, the combustion of biogas collected from biological decomposition of waste in landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and manure management. They also identify the combustion of the biological fraction of municipal solid waste. Now, I show this list and I pulled these out as examples from the CPP rule that EPA identified, but I did it at a little bit of a risk because I don't want anybody to consider this a comprehensive list. There may certainly be variations and subcategories submitted by states and approved by EPA. My purpose in showing this is simply to show you that what EPA itself identifies in the plan, and that it is consistent with that definition that they provided and that I went over a little bit earlier. It's not until we get deep into the CPP rule itself in Section 5 where there's a discussion of that building block number 3, and to just refresh your memory, that's the building block where they identified low and zero carbon substitution for fossil fuel-fired electric generation. EPA recognizes that the combustion of biomass has potential CO2 benefits. They conclude that it's reasonable to consider biomass as a renewable energy. So I think that's an important thing to note, that when EPA, under discussion of building block number 3, talked about renewable energy, they do include biomass in there. But in order to be approved in a state plan, biomass has to be sourced responsibly, and its carbon cycle assessment has to be taken into consideration. They go on to talk a little bit about co-firing as well, and I don't want to get too deep involved in the discussion of co-firing right now, but EPA also recognizes the potential CO2 benefits of co-firing biomass in coal-fired power plants. One of the things that they point out is that's not probably going to be universally advantageous, and so they don't include it as part of the building block. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because here's the first part in the Clean Power Plan rule where EPA brings out the term qualified biomass. EPA recognizes that the level of sustainability of the source of the biomass feedstock is going to be a critical factor in whether or not biomass is accepted in state plans. And that's going to be a big part of the discussion as we move on here. That whole concept of what makes qualified biomass. Moving on in the CPP rule, the real meat of the biomass discussion comes in Section 8, where there are 4 subsections that explain the methods and considerations that states should go through in order to gain EPA approval of biomass use under various scenarios. I list those 4 sections there. I'm not going to go through in detail on those, but in the beginning of this section, EPA clearly states, and this is important, they clearly state that it's not scientifically valid to assume that all biogenic feedstocks are carbon neutral, but that the net CO2 contribution of different biomass feedstocks are going to vary and depend on various factors, including the feedstock type and characteristics, production practices, and in some cases, particularly in the waste derived component, the alternative fate of the feedstock. So EPA is saying here, not all feedstocks are considered carbon neutral, and that not all biogenic feedstocks are expected to be approvable. Now that last phrase is actually a quote right out of the CPP rule, that not all biogenic feedstocks are expected to be approvable. EPA does go on to talk about also the relationship between sustainable forestry and sustainable ag practices, and the role of those sustainable practices in determining whether or not a biomass feedstock is considered qualified biomass. Bottom line is that it's going to be up to the states in their plans to describe how proposed feedstocks will be deemed qualified, and all of that is subject to EPA approval. So EPA does then give some more guidance on, all right, so here's what we're looking for from states and their plans for us to be able to approve them. They do that also continuing on in Section 8 in the CPP Rule itself, where they identify what they'll be looking for in the state plans to approve a particular feedstock as qualified. They'll be looking for, one, a description of the proposed feedstock, an explanation of how the state itself has determined its qualifications. Number 3 is pretty important, is the actual quantification of the attributable net CO2 reduction. And another important component is the establishment of monitoring, reporting, and verification measures. And they point out specifically that they're going to be looking for specifics on that component of it. EPA advises states to obtain guidance through a document we'll talk about a little more in depth here in a moment. It's called the Framework for Assessing Biogenic CO2 Emissions from Stationary Sources, as well as outcomes of a peer review of that document by the EPA Science Advisory Board. So let's talk a little bit about that. Almost anywhere in the CPP Rule where they talk about biomass, EPA directs readers to technical guidance. That technical guidance is this framework, sometimes referred to as the revised framework or the 2014 framework. But what they're referring to is a document called the Framework for Assessing Biogenic CO2 Emissions from Stationary Sources. EPA's goal with this framework is to use the best science available to account for CO2 emissions of stationary sources. That's taking into account the biological cycling of carbon into consideration. So it's not just the CO2 emissions related to the natural carbon cycle of the biomass material itself, but also those emissions associated with the production, harvest, digestion, fermentation, decomposition, or any other processing of the biomass fuel. It's important to note that the framework is not specific to the Clean Power Plan process, nor any other particular program for that matter. In simple terms, it's EPA's attempt to use best science to evaluate and quantify the technical elements that need to be considered when assessing carbon emissions from biogenic fuel sources. The framework evaluates and addresses key technical elements that should be considered. One very significant purpose of the 2014 framework was to develop a method for calculating the adjustment, or what they refer to as the biogenic accounting factor for biogenic feedstocks, based on the carbon cycle effects associated with the feedstock growth, harvest, and processing. So this is a mathematical adjustment to stack emissions to account for the feedstock or source-specific factors that affect its own life cycle CO2 emissions. The framework also breaks down biomass into 3 categories and evaluates and provides guidance for each of those 3. And one is forestry-derived biomass, ag biomass, and waste-derived biomass. The draft framework document was published in 2011, and at that time EPA convened a panel of the EPA's Science Advisory Board to perform a peer review and provide comments and recommendations to further refine and account for biogenic CO2 using best science. It was a 17-member panel called the Biogenic Carbon Emissions Panel. I'll just refer to them as the panel. They provided comments on that 2011 draft, and those comments and recommendations and suggestions by the panel were highly influential in the resulting 2014 release of the revised framework document. Now that was released in November 2014, and since then EPA has reconvened that panel and requested the Science Advisory Board's input on several additional aspects in order to further refine and improve our ability to accurately assess the net impacts of biogenic CO2 on reducing atmospheric CO2 levels. The panel has a series of meetings scheduled in 2015. They've had face-to-face meetings, and mostly they're doing teleconferences, the most recent which occurred in September of 2015. The Science Advisory Board panel has also recently drafted a report on its review of the 2000 framework, and they continue to refine it. There's a public involvement opportunity in this process that I think is worth noting. So anyone interested in learning about or even influencing the process for possibly inclusion of biomass in a state plan, you really need to keep up on the activities of this Science Advisory Board. I provided links in this slide. I know on this, what you're looking at, you don't have access to make those live. Hopefully through Sarah we can make those available to you. And what I included was a link to information on the Science Advisory Board, their panel, their meeting schedule, and I also included a link to the draft report. I would recommend that anybody who is who's a stakeholder in this process, who has a passion for wanting to include biomass up there with some of the more prominently discussed potential roles of other renewable sources, I think it would be a good idea to review this document and also take advantage of the opportunities to provide comment. So, how will biomass ultimately play out in any particular state's clean power plan? Well, if you've participated, like I have, in other webinars or meetings on the Clean Power Plan, you find that there's a lot more questions often than there are answers. And when there are answers, they're often not very clear. And we say, hey, look, we're so early on in this process, we're not sure. And that's really the answer that I have for you here. There's no clear and specific answer at this point. But what is important, and what we do know, is that the framework for the inclusion of biomass is laid out for us in the Clean Power Plan Rule and in the technical documents and guidance followed up by EPA. We know that biomass is clearly identified in the rule as a renewable energy, and EPA certainly expects that some states will include a biomass component in their plans. Yes, EPA has published the framework and acknowledges the potential role, but it's going to be up to the states to propose specific approaches within their plans that will enable biomass power to be a significant part of CO2 reductions. And with the emphasis on other higher profile approaches to low carbon, no carbon generation, such as wind and solar and nuclear, and even energy efficiency, how is it that biomass is going to end up on any particular state's radar? Well, that's where many of you are going to come in. Those of you listening to this webinar obviously have an interest in the use of biomass power. And I think that biomass advocates are going to be key in this process. While some states may have biomass as part of an internal initiative or a strategy already in the works, others may not even be considering biomass, along with some of the other, and I'll say, quote, mainstream approaches, such as solar, wind, and energy efficiency, that seem to grab the most interest and the most headlines, and we certainly get the most comments on those. Pennsylvania DEP has been actively seeking public comment on the development of its clean power plant strategy, and I can tell you that the proponents of solar and wind and energy efficiency and even nuclear energy are out in force giving us comments, trying to direct us. My advice to you as proponents of the use of biomass energy is to get involved in whatever stakeholder process is being held by your state or even the federal government as they consider what will be in the model federal plan, which is what would be imposed on states that do not enact their own plans. So to give you an example here, I list a few things, or a couple things that Pennsylvania is currently in the process of doing. in preparing for the development of the draft submittal that's due September of 2016, Pennsylvania is right now undergoing a series of what we're calling listening sessions. These are 14 sessions we have scheduled throughout the state where people can register to come speak. They'll be recorded. It's not an interactive process at the listening sessions, but what we're getting is a lot of proponents of different approaches. We're even getting some people who show up and say, hey, Pennsylvania shouldn't be doing anything with this. But we are having a lot of folks come up and they're talking about solar, they're talking about wind, they're talking about nuclear. But my advice to anybody who is proposing to come provide comment to Pennsylvania or even other states, my advice to people is, listen, the time for cheerleading on these things is over. We really need to propose solutions, okay? Pennsylvania has, on its Clean Power Plan website, actually has listed several questions that we're asking those who are commenting to Pennsylvania. Take a look at those questions and give input to help us answer those. So we're looking for people to help be a part and guide us towards solutions, not just just say, hey, I think that biomass should be considered and turn around and walk away. We're looking for some specific help. And I think that many states, there might be some states also that have formed advocacy groups or other opportunities to get more interactive stakeholder engagement. I have that listed here with some question marks because we get asked about that fairly often. Is there an opportunity to not just provide written public comment or submit comments online or say them in a listening session, but actually sit down and engage the people who are involved in development of the plan? We get asked that question a lot, and I don't have a firm answer in Pennsylvania. It's been discussed. And I think it's something that is a possibility, and take a look within your states and within the federal government to find those opportunities for more interactive stakeholder engagement. So at this point, what I've done is I've gone through and just kind of laid out how EPA is preparing for states to be able to submit their Clean Power Plan draft plans, and how biomass could potentially fit into there. And at this point, I guess what I'll do is I'll turn it over to see if there are any questions. And again, I guess I'll repeat, many of you have probably been like me and you've sat in on webinars and meetings and been maybe a little bit frustrated by the fact that there has been maybe not clear answers. I don't know that I'm going to have clear answers for you. I'll do my best, but we may have to follow up. We may have to wait and see what kind of guidance comes out of groups like the Science Advisory Board and their ongoing review of that framework document. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. Anyone who has a question, please type it into the chat pod, which you see on the left-hand side of your screen down at the bottom. And again, if you'd like an individual email with follow-ups and explicit lists of all the links that we've talked about already, and a lot of the dates and things that we've already presented, shoot me an email. It's in the chat pod there, and I will make sure that you get a copy of that. So again, type in your questions. In the meantime, I guess I'll kick off with a couple of my own. So I want to focus on this idea that, not all biomass is equal, and I think most of us working in this industry understand that concept very well. And if we understand the concept very well, we also acknowledge how complicated it is to approach that concept. So when you mentioned the need to do quantification of attributable net carbon reduction for qualified biomass under this program. So to be clear, the framework that you described that's overseen by the Scientific Advisory Board, that would sort of give a model or an example of the protocols that would be required for each of the state plans. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, that plan even includes, not the plan, the framework document includes mathematical equations and shows here's how you're going to do this. And I think that that's one of those things is going to continue to be refined as well. the that framework document is over 50 pages long, and a lot of it is dealing with that quantification. And I think an important point here, though, and it's kind of part of one of the themes of this presentation, is don't necessarily expect that those on the state side who are writing the Clean Power plan for the state are going to know that information. They're going to be expecting somebody who comes in who wants to make a pitch for a certain type of approach to help guide them and say, here's how I think this is going to go. So hopefully, Sarah, that gives you somewhat of an answer.
Yeah, so is this relatively new for the Clean Power Plan, or are there examples of other pieces of legislation that have used that framework to do accounting?
Now, one of the things in the framework is they say specifically this is not specific for the Clean Power Plan, but no, I don't. It's generally it is technical guidance on how to assess the CO2 impacts of biomass sources, regardless of what type of regulatory program or other program somebody may want to apply that to.
Okay. So assuming that a state would put together a plan using this framework as a guide for suggesting the use of qualified biomass as part of its portfolio, what would ultimately be the overseeing body that would verify that qualification? Would there be oversight at the state level or federal level to verify that qualification?
That's one of those that they don't know what the final answer is going to be on that. The state is certainly responsible for the implementation of its plan, and the EPA is responsible for approving it. The EPA is going to hold the state responsible for measurement and verification, but it's going to be the details of the plan, and we're going to see then who is it that is going to need to provide that, that information that will ultimately verify compliance. And I don't know ultimately what the answer is going to be to that.
Okay, great, thanks. So Dan follows up with a question that's probably appropriate at this point. He asks about if there's explicitly set aside federal funding provided to the states to help develop and or implement the plan. So for a lot of that work and a lot of that oversight that is expected to happen at the state level and regulated and overseen by the state, is there funding for that? And then are there expectations as to the economic benefit or cost that's associated with that implementation?
This is where we're getting into where not being an expert on the actual implementation of the CPP plan itself, or the development of the plan. I have not heard of any federal funding that's come available to help with the implementation of the plan. I think where the expectations of economic benefit come in are going to be, the one place where I saw that discussed is under those building blocks, those best systems for emissions reduction, where those building blocks were developed with that cost effectiveness component built into them. One of the things that we did not discuss, and I did not want to go into detail in because it's kind of nebulous at this point of which direction some states are going to go, but there is the possibility of the development of allowances or emissions reduction credits that will be marketable, that will help bring certain technologies and certain approaches into a more favorable economic opportunity for reducing CO2 emissions.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's where I was going to go with your response. And yeah, the market-based approach is one that's really, really emphasized very strongly in a lot of the fact sheets that have come out around the plan as a galvanization to promote innovation under this plan. And one of the things in particular that I'm curious about, the plan notes the possibility for interstate sharing of those emissions credits. So do you see the possibility for, we're talking about Pennsylvania today, but Pennsylvania and New York to have a sort of hybrid plan that would involve some trading between industries or between approaches? would the two states that are working together have to do the same sort of, whether it's a rate-based approach or a mass-based approach? Would they have to be on the same accounting system, or could there be a mixed approach to those as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know, and I'm not sure if anybody knows yet the details of such an approach, but clearly it is something that EPA is expecting that states are going to do, and there's some decisions that need to be made on the state level of the development of trading plans and where the boundaries of those are going to be. And those are all the types of things that Pennsylvania is looking for, and I'm sure other states are also looking for input on. So if any of you see an advantage to one approach or another, or if you think that, hey, if a particular type of trading program or a mass-based approach with allowances for that would enable biomass to be much more competitive, those are the kinds of things that you should be telling your states.
Do you have an idea of how much flexibility will be allowed once the initial plan is approved? I mean, it's obviously a pretty long implementation period. So the plans are due next September. So let's say a plan is submitted. It seems like there should be room for some follow-up and maybe trading that happens of emissions credits, whether on a mass basis or some kind of trading ready rate basis, without the need for an upfront interstate agreement that could maybe happen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea of how much flexibility that what you would expect to see?
Again, I don't know the details, but I do know that this is going to be, it's definitely something that is going to be continued to be refined and improved as we move forward. And I think people are looking for the best approaches. And as we proceed through the implementation of a plan, and there are opportunities to improve it, I think that we'll see that flexibility given by EPA, because ultimately the goal here is to reduce CO2 emissions. So I think that flexibility, we're seeing a lot of flexibility from the beginning of this, so I expect that to continue.
Okay, yeah. So you've already mentioned the very important tool of listening sessions. Dan writes a question. He wants to know that other than just providing feedback at those in a sort of one-way situation, are there other ways we can be involved that maybe are more dynamic or address a very specific need or uncertainty that's been identified in the state approach?
Yeah, Dan, that's a great question. It's something that I was trying to touch on the one slide. One of the things that has been discussed, I've been asked about it numerous times, and I've heard it discussed internally as well, is when is there going to be an opportunity for more interactive stakeholder involvement? And I don't have an answer for you, Dan. I apologize for that. It's something that I'll take that question back to our policy folks and find out, and I'll get back to Sarah and see if I can post an answer that's more specific here. And I apologize for not having a better answer for you on that.
So Jeff, I mean, you worked in biomass in one way or another for quite a long time, and you hold positions for the state that look at these assessments on a number of different scales. So I mean, I'm curious if you had to pick, not necessarily saying that there's a very specific way to do engagement on this for the Clean Power Plan right now, but if you had to pick sort of one subject or one category in which you would identify a knowledge gap in Pennsylvania's approach to biomass energy in general, that could be filled with ongoing engagement or research or outreach work, what might you choose, just as a sort of personal opinion?
I think, Sarah, I'm not sure I understand exactly where you're going with the question, but I will say that my advice to anybody who would be trying to interact with their state on the development of a plan that enables biomass is to is to try to get every discussion of renewable energy to include biomass. How many times have we seen any discussion of renewable energy? Very often they leave out biomass. Keep that discussion going. Um, I think another thing to do would be to give clear examples of where you think the best opportunities might be, whether that is in co-firing of biomass in coal-fired power plants up to a certain percentage, whether that is the implementation of distributed generation projects such as combined heat and power projects. Um, Lead the plan developers to particular types of projects that you think hold the best potential for cost-effective electric generation. And that's where I think that the plan developers could probably use the most, I guess, input on. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Sarah.
Yeah, I think those are two really fantastic points that most people working in this industry would really agree with as a gap in terms of sort of general knowledge and engagement on this. Barb follows up to Dan's question that I think really ties in very well with what you just said. She talks about how beyond the time for cheerleading and sort of comment periods, she asks about the strategies for wind and solar advocates are using to keep and or get their systems in front of decision makers who will be setting out the state plan. It seems like there's a very well organized awareness around those industries. Is that something that could be modeled for biomass?
It sure could. In fact, just came across my inbox today was the identification of some training sessions that an environmental organization in Pennsylvania is putting on to train speakers who are coming to the listening sessions on how to put together an effective presentation to ensure that renewable energy gets its best consideration within Pennsylvania's plan. That is something that the biomass industry could get together and come up with a common approach and identify the questions that they think that the states are going to need answered, and go out and give it to them.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, and certainly something that I know you work with the Pennsylvania Biomass Energy Association. Certainly seems like a good cheerleader for that kind of thing. That maybe people could engage with PBEA to get that conversation going.
There are some folks within PBEA who are very interested in this as an opportunity, and I can engage them in that discussion. There are other biomass organizations as well that that could also serve as kind of a focal point of that.
Great, thanks. So we have another question coming from Mike, asking you to, again, speculate a little bit and kind of talk fast and loose here with your opinions. But he asks, why do you think that wind and solar really dominate the renewable and alternative energy discussion, and biomass tends to get left out in that discussion?
I'll give you my personal opinion here. I mean, obviously, wind and solar are kind of the sexy renewable energy. That's what people learn about up front. That's what the younger generation hears about. I think there's still a perception issue with biomass. In doing a little bit of research and preparing for this presentation, there are actually organizations who are working against the use of the inclusion of biomass in Clean Power Plan compliance. Some of the biomass projects I've been involved in the past, gasification projects, biomass thermal projects even, there's this perception that biomass projects refer to cutting down trees and burning them, and that there's emissions problems associated with that, and why would you want to cut down trees? I think it's a perception issue, and how can you be against solar? Yeah, there's a lot of opponents for against wind as well, but yeah, you're right. I mean, there's biomass often gets left out of that discussion, and I think it's just it's an education opportunity.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that in similar pieces of legislation that the same quantification and qualification standards are required for wind and solar proposals. I mean, they're probably just easier to sell because you don't have to qualify it as sustainable biomass or sustainable wind, sustainable solar. Nobody's ever really suggested unsustainable solar is something to worry about.
Yeah, and like I said, you see, there are anti-wind people, there are anti-biomass people, except for on I guess, a real political level, you don't see a whole lot of anti-solar people out there. But if, I know that if I go out and I speak at an event somewhere and I talk about solar, I'll have all kinds of people wanting to talk to me after the presentation. Wind people are interested in, but biomass, it just seems to be such a focused group. Doesn't have
Yeah,
that broad appeal.
yeah, that's a good point. So as we think about, clearly part of what we're talking about is the need to really keep it part of the conversation, have our comments heard at these comment periods. So as a couple of housekeeping things, could you provide that list of listening sessions and dates, that workshop that you described where speakers are trained in how to comment effectively at those kinds of meetings? Do you think you
Yes.
could provide us with that list, and I can make sure that our participants today are able to see that list, and we can publicize it on our website as well?
Sure, I'll provide those. And in the meantime, I believe it's Penn Future that was doing the training for those listening sessions.
All right, we'll certainly keep an eye out for that. Another participant has asked if you wouldn't mind sharing a copy of your PowerPoint presentation. We could make that available on our website as well.
Sure.
Excellent. And just as a reminder, I mean, we still have plenty of time for questions, but I just want to reiterate the fact that a copy of today's webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded to a YouTube site. So if you know someone who is interested in hearing this discussion and seeing what it's all about and maybe attending some of those listening sessions, please do share that link with them. We should have it up on our website live, hopefully sometime tomorrow. So looks like we're getting a couple of other questions in. So I guess while Harvey is typing, let me ask another question to you, Jeff. So you mentioned that combined heat and power, and in the Clean Power Plan Toolbox for the states, one of the main technical reports for biomass that it provides relates to combined heat and power installments. It seems like the CPP is really focused on large-scale producers of major power plants and things like that. But I guess when I think of something like combined heat and power or biomass thermal, I think of it succeeding a lot at that commercial and institutional scale that's quite a bit smaller. Do you see room for those somewhat smaller scale projects within the state plans?
I do see that. It depends on the approach that the state takes. If the state takes an approach that um, enables the use of emissions reduction credits or allowances, um, in a virtual market is created that can create a sellable commodity, which is that credit that could benefit small scale CHP projects, along with other types of projects as well. So, but I agree, it does at first glance look like, this is just looking at the large power plants, but I think there are going to be opportunities. It's the same thing. Energy efficiency is built into, or is a demand side energy efficiency is identified as one of the building blocks. A lot of those are going to be small scale implementation projects that are going to accumulate to much greater effect. And I think the same thing can happen with distributed generation projects, including biomass CHP projects.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a willingness not to want to get too specifically into co-firing here, but co-firing does seem like a pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of ease of implementation and technical needs in terms of implementation. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as something that we are likely to see in Pennsylvania?
I think it's possible. Yeah, that's a great question. And when I said I didn't want to get into the co-firing, it was only in that section. I didn't want to get bogged down in that section of the CPP where they talked about co-firing. They were using it as an example. I don't mind discussing co-firing. Uh, I think it's a possibility. There's a lot of legwork that's going to have to be done in order to convince the larger power plants. I was involved in a biomass co-firing project at a coal-fired power plant, and it's a lot of work. It was a lot of adjustments needed at the plant, to adjust the process at the plant. It was not easy. And if we're looking at um, if what we're looking at is the need to move quickly on this, co-firing is going to be difficult, but it could potentially have huge benefits. So I think it's something that very well could be looked at, and whoever is going to, I think like I said, it's going to be a lot of legwork on the part of whoever is going to convince the power plants that that is a reasonable approach to take.
Yeah, it's really the scale that makes that an attractive option. But you're right, there is a lot of complicated procurement logistics and sort of implementation logistics associated with it. But it is an interesting question for especially for
Yeah,
Pennsylvania, where there is so much coal activity still.
yep, I agree.
Okay, so Harvey has asked if there's a specific sort of point person for questions or comments within the DEP. If we're not present in a listening session, that comments can be submitted to. Maybe along with that list of listening sessions that you're going to send out to us, we can make sure to include that point of contact on our communications with participants.
Well, I was hoping that this discussion wouldn't fall back on a Pennsylvania discussion and just the DEP discussion. But within Pennsylvania, there is a team working on it, and that team is headed up right now. The point person on that team is somebody who actually just left on maternity leave. So I would say right now, and this is my safe answer right here, is to address specific comments to the DEP Secretary, John Quigley, or the DEP Policy Director, Patrick McDonnell. Then you'll be assured that those comments will get to that team. At this point, I feel, since I have not discussed this specifically with the team itself or people within that team, I'm a little uncomfortable of giving a specific individual's name within that team, but I know that that team is headed up. It's the DEP Secretary and Policy Director who I think could funnel that information to that team. Okay. Sorry, I don't have anything more specific for you at this point.
That's fine. That'll work just fine. Yeah, and just keep looking at the New Bio website for that list of resources. I'll make sure it goes up quickly. So if there are any last minute questions, feel free to type them in. Don't feel constrained by time. But at this point, Jeff, if there are any final thoughts you want to leave us with, any last minute, if there's one thing you want us to take away from the presentation today, I'd love for you to voice that now.
I guess the emphasize, and we've been talking about this the whole time, the stakeholder process, but know that many different interests are trying to get in front of the people who are putting these plans together. We have a process in place to do that, and I'm sure other states do as well. Be patient with the folks involved. Lead them as best you can to the conclusions that you would hope that they get to, but know that there are many competing interests in a relatively short time period here. So I guess that's the biggest takeaway for this is take advantage of the opportunities and be patient and realistic with this process, and I can guarantee you that the people involved in it on our end, in Pennsylvania at least, are very professional and dedicated people who want to do